Hey everyone, welcome back. We're going to continue our lecture on Anatomy and Physiology 233 Endocrine chapter 16, and we left off in the lecture notes just about to do the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus, and I'm going to be referring to a picture in the book, and so I'm going to go there first and show you where we are, and then we'll start with the notes. So these are the notes, and you can see this picture right here. This picture is a kind of conglomerate of a couple different pictures that are in your book. So if we bring up your book notes here, it says focus figure 16.1, and that is correct. It's on page 610, looks and 611, and it's got two parts, and it's showing on one side the excuse me, the posterior pituitary there, and then on this side it shows the anterior pituitary. And one thing that I want to note is, depending on which way you're looking at the pituitary, you're going to either see the posterior on the left side and the anterior on the right, or if you looked at it in a different orientation, you'd see the opposite. So if you notice, this one does have the posterior pituitary on the right side going towards the posterior there, and the anterior going towards the anterior part. But if you look at our notes are reversed. This is the posterior pituitary, and this is the anterior pituitary. So this way the skull, the eyes of the skull would be over here on the anterior side, and we'd be looking this way. So my point is that you shouldn't rely on a left or a right to be anterior or posterior. You should look at the structures and try to figure out what's different about them. And you can see right away that there's differences here. We have a lot of cells with kind of a lot of glandular looking cells here, and we have a lot of neuron processes here, and that's really the difference between the posterior pituitary and the anterior pituitary. Now I'll try to write on this as best I can, but it is hard here using my Surface Pen to write on things and write well. So what I may do is draw a couple arrows to things or leave some things blank, but have you fill them in yourself using the book picture. So we'll see how that works. Okay, so let's start right here. The pituitary gland. Now it has another name, the hypophysis. So you're going to hear that term as well, and you need to know that, the hypophysis. But often we just refer to it as the pituitary gland. And you might remember that it lies in the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone, where the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland kind of sit in that little saddle-like part of the sphenoid bone. And it's connected to the hypothalamus by a stalk-like structure called the infundibulum. And that is, the whole infundibulum is this section here. I'm going to zoom in, and I'm going to draw this. So this little stalk, this whole thing that you see there that I've just highlighted, is the infundibulum. So right there. Now this particular thing that this line is on right here, do you see this little line right there? That is something else. So we're going to highlight the tract in a few minutes. But that whole area that's holding the pituitary gland underneath the hypothalamus is called the infundibulum. Now, as I just said a minute ago, there's two different functional and structural components. So the posterior pituitary gland is also called the neurohypophysis because it has a lot of neurons that go in there, and is kind of connected more to the brain, where the anterior pituitary gland is much more glandular, and we call that the adenohypophysis. All right, and so let's put those in really quickly. And all I'm going to write is POST for posterior and ANT for anterior, just so I don't make this too messy. So right here, this is the posterior lobe right there. Okay, and on this side, this is the anterior lobe right there. Okay, so now if you look at the book, what the book has done is it has separated them. So it has the posterior lobe on the other side, and it has the anterior lobe here. And so they've broken this out, and so that's really nice, so you can see them separately and see how they act kind of separately. And one of the reasons that they did that is because this is a composite gland, meaning that the gland has both neurological aspects and glandular aspects, and so they're showing you the two sides there. Notice that the blood supply comes from the internal carotids, and there are some arteries that the way I'm going to do this, I think, just again so I don't have to write a lot, is I'll just put a little star here, and I'll put a little circle here. Okay, it's colored in, a little colored in circle, and make my star just a little bit prettier. Okay, and so the branches off the internal carotid arteries are going to supply different things. So the superior hypophyseal artery goes to the anterior pituitary and also supplies the infundibulum. So let's highlight that. Okay, and let's show you where that is over here. So if we go over here, you can see right here. Oops, let's erase that. And put a little star right there. Okay, there's my little star. Okay. And then you might notice that there's another artery that is inferior right here, and we'll put our little circle right there. And that is the one that is going to supply blood to the posterior pituitary. Now the other thing to note about these arteries is that if they're supplying blood and blood is leaving, then blood is also going to be exiting out in various places, and you can see some veins there. And that's where they're going to be taking hormones. Hormones are going to be leaving out the same bloodstream, out the venous side. All right, so let me undo what I just did there. Uh-oh. Somehow I just moved all of my things down one. That was annoying. How do I select that? I'm going to pause for a minute. Okay, I'm back. I've got it straightened out. So somehow I touched the stuff and moved it down. But let's move here to the pituitary hypothalamic relationship. So now we're looking at how it's interacting with the hypothalamus. Now the hypothalamus is up above there. I'm not going to label it, but all of those three nuclei, remember nuclei are where cell bodies are congregating together from neurons, and you can see a bunch of cell bodies in those three areas. All three of those are in the hypothalamus. So you'll notice right away, if we kind of keep this picture up, that there are some processes from the two most right nuclei. The cell bodies have axon processes that go down through the infundibulum and go over to the posterior pituitary, and that's where their axon terminals are. So that's kind of interesting. So we call this, in the posterior pituitary, an outgrowth of the nerve processes and terminals of the hypothalamus, where the cell bodies live. And these are coming from two different nuclei, the paraventricular nucleus and the supraoptic nucleus. Okay, and I'll put in which is which. I'm just going to write para up above and supra up above, so I hope that is okay, so you can figure out where those are. So we're going to zoom in here. This is para, and this is supra. Okay, and I'm going to write another thing in right now, and we'll talk about it later, but you might have noticed that it had oxytocin, or OT. That's a T there. Oh, that's horrible. Let's redo that. OT. All right, and then supra had ADH next to it. And so let's put those in. So those are the hormones that are going to come from those areas, and we'll talk about those a little later. So we've got those. The axon terminals go all the way down and are right there, and then there are little pituocytes that support those, keep them alive and feed them and whatnot. And you'll see some of those in your lab slides. So that's where the axon terminals end. And I'm not going to write it in, but right here, if I write here is where you could write axon terminals if you want, because those are the axon terminals. Okay. Now, the thing that I was talking about earlier, where I said there was something going through the infundibulum, but didn't have its own, or it had its own little thing here, and I'm going to put a little triangle here, if I can. All right. For some reason it keeps erasing. Let's triangle. Okay, little triangle. Okay, that triangle there is representing what's called the hypothalamic. Try to keep it so you can see it there. Hypothalamic hypophyseal tract. We often call it just the HH tract to make life a little bit easier on our what we're saying. And I'm going to put that little triangle right here so you can see that triangle. So now you know where that triangle is. So that is the pathway that hormones that are made up here in these two nuclei that we just were talking about will travel down through the axon terminal. And they will go down, 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 and they'll be stored in the axon terminals here in the posterior pituitary. Okay, and that's what this is saying right here. And this note is really an important one, so let's put a couple exclamation points there on either side of it, since I've already used a star on this page. It says the neurohormones oxytocin and ADH are synthesized in the hypothalamus. Okay, and I'm going to actually underline that. All right, then transported and stored in the axon terminals in the posterior pituitary. So they're made up in the hypothalamus, but they're stored in the posterior pituitary. And then when nerve impulses from the hypothalamus stimulate the axon terminals, they'll release those hormones. So this is one of those neural ways that we release hormones that we talked about in the last lecture. Okay, now the anterior pituitary is maybe a little more simple. It comes from a interesting. It comes from an outgrowth of the oral mucosa, and so it ends up being glandular in composition. And you can see, if you look at the picture up there, that there's a lot of glandular-looking cells, cells that are going to be secreting material. And it adheres during embryonic development to the neurohypophysis and becomes a composite organ, basically where we have nervous tissue in the posterior pituitary and glandular tissue in the anterior pituitary. So that is how we get the pituitary gland together. And so I'm going to underline composite organ because we do sometimes use that term, that it's a combination of the nervous and glandular tissue. Now it connects with the hypothalamus a different way, and it connects through the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system. So the HH portal system. So we have an HH tract and we have an HH portal system. Now, if you remember, portal systems are different in that they are a vascular connection that is often like venous to capillaries to venous system. So the portal system, if you look at this, you'll notice that you have some capillaries up here, okay, and you have a little pathway and then more capillaries here. And so this is a portal system. So I'm going to write on as best I can here, HH portal system. Okay. So what is it getting? Well, notice where it's going around. It's going around some axon terminals right here in the center, and those go up to this other nuclei. And this other nuclei represents other nuclei that are in the in the hypothalamus, and you don't need to know the name of this one, but what this does, these nuclei up here do, is they, and I'm going to write this in as best I can, as soon as I get back into my pen. These produce and release, they produce releasing and inhibiting hormones. Okay. So certain hormones are made up here in the hypothalamus, and these hormones are going to go down and stimulate. They're going to go down through, be released in these axon terminals, go into the HH portal system. So they're going to be made here. They're going to travel down here. They're going to be released into the portal system, and they're going to go in to the anterior pituitary. And they are going to either, if they're releasing hormones, tell the anterior pituitary to make and release other hormones that will leave and go out into the body. If they're inhibiting hormones, they will actually tell the anterior pituitary to shut off and not release any hormones at all. We're going to talk about specific releasing and inhibiting hormones a little bit later, probably in the next lecture. And so what I just wrote is what is written down here. So it says, and let's put exclamation points at this one as well, because this note is important as well. The hypothalamus secretes regulating hormones inhibiting or releasing into the portal system, which circulate directly to the adenohypophysis. Remember, that's the anterior pituitary, where they secrete, there's a missing word there, where they regulate the secretion of glandular cells. Where they, let's put a little caret in here, regulate the secretion, the secretion of glandular cells. Okay. Now, we want to just talk for a moment about how some of the hormones that are in the pituitary gland are actually made. All right, and we're going to do this pretty quick. This is not as super important to me, but I want to highlight a couple things. So there is a prohormone. Now, a prohormone, remember, I think we talked a little bit about precursor molecules last term, where we'd have a pro in front of something like prothrombin, right? So these are inactive. They're a precursor molecule, and all you have to do is quickly make one little change to them, or break them off in some way or alter them slightly, and then you'll get an active hormone. So we have enzymes that will work on these prohormones and then make different things. So the precursor hormone is called pro-opiomelanocortin, or POMC. Okay. And the anterior pituitary can make some of these, and some of these show up in other places as well. Now, why is it called pro-opiomelanocortin? Well, it's referring to some of the hormones that it can make. So let's look at the terms really quickly here. So opio is standing for opiates, okay, like endorphins, right? So that's where that is. Melano is producing melanocyte stimulating hormone, and that stimulating hormone will help the skin produce melanin. And then cortin comes from the cortico of adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH. And we're going to talk about ACTH in a minute down below. It's going to stimulate the adrenal cortex to make cortisol, so that's where the cortin comes from, cortisol. We've also found that it does a couple other things. Lipotropins, fat breakdown, and it's believed to be a hypothalamic neurotransmitter as well. So that's interesting that this one precursor molecule, this prohormone, can make all these different things. Kind of amazing. All right, so now we want to talk about, before I get here, we already mentioned that two hormones are made up in the hypothalamus and they are stored down in the pituitary gland on the posterior side. Can you remember what those were? Those were oxytocin, OT, and antidiuretic hormone, ADH. So we have two hormones on the posterior pituitary side that we need to know about. And we're going to talk more about those later. There are 6 anterior pituitary hormones that you need to know about. And these are, and there's even more, but there's 6 that I want you to know. And so these 6 are the ones I'm going to underline here. 4 of them are tropic, and tropic means that they regulate the function of another endocrine gland. So that hormone goes down and stimulates another gland in some way. So look at these 4 hormones that do that. They're named pretty well. Thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH. It's going to stimulate your thyroid. Adrenocorticotropic hormone is going to go down to the cortisol area of the adrenal gland. Follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, they work together and work on your gonads, your ovaries and your testes. Okay, so there's 4. Now there are 2 that are non-tropic, and these non-tropic ones do not affect endocrine targets. They affect other body cells. So one is prolactin, and you may realize that that's probably going to have to do with lactation, so it's going to be acting on breast tissue. And then growth hormone, and growth hormone works on many, many different body cells. And we're going to talk about growth hormone in the very next lecture. There's also that melanocyte stimulating hormone, and it's made in a different part, this intermediate part between the 2 pituitary gland sides, and I'm not going to worry too much about that one right now. Focus on those 6 that I've just highlighted in green and yellow. All right. Now the last thing that I want to talk about is these axes, and all the axes mean it's. Sometimes people get confused by this, but I just want to explain what's happening here. Is this axis is saying that something is being made up here. Okay, and notice that this picture is flipped. The anterior pituitary now is on the left, and the posterior is on the right. And remember, don't focus on that that left or right. You just have to look at it and figure out which one is anterior and which one is posterior. So these are where the releasing and inhibiting hormones are being produced, and they're going down to here, and they're releasing these different hormones here that we just talked about, these 6 hormones, and then they go out to some organ. And so the organ is the last part. So we have a hypothalamic part, which is this part right here. We have a pituitary part, which is the red right there. And then we have an organ part, which is the black. Okay. So all these axes refer to are, we're having releasing hormones. See, there's an R here, that's for releasing hormone. We're sending that down to deal with the pituitary hormones, in this case FSH and LH. And then it goes out to the gonads, and the gonads are going to produce some hormones of their own. That's what the axis is. So we have this link between the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and the gonads. We have a link between the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and the thyroid. We have a releasing hormone, we have a stimulating hormone, and then we have the hormones that the thyroid releases. Okay? And we even have one for the adrenal gland. We have a releasing hormone, the hormone that stimulates the adrenal gland, specifically the cortex, and we have cortisol being released. That's all these axes mean, okay? So you don't need to necessarily memorize them, but just know that there's this process of hormone interacting with a gland that releases a hormone, which interacts with an organ, and that will also release a hormone. So these are all hormonally released hormones that we're seeing here. All right, I think I'm going to stop, and we're going to start the next lecture, and we're going to do human growth hormone. So this actually should be on the next page. I think it is in the regular notes, but for some reason when I put them online, it switched it. So we're going to put growth hormone here. We're going to write growth hormone. All right, and I'll actually type that in to make it look prettier. And we're going to go over this chart and try to fill this chart in the best we can to understand how growth hormone affects so many things. So that's what we'll do next time. All right. Thanks, everyone. We'll talk at the next lecture and start going over specific hormones. Okay.